Billy Creekmore, Chapter 21. I become a Union man, and we face our first battle with Mr. Newgate and his guards. The men gave me a big hurrah for joining, but a minute later they went back to their arguing. Folks had different ideas about what should go first on our list of demands. Most miners hated cribbing more than anything else, but others wanted the company to make the job safer. Mr. Moon had the idea that the company should send in inspectors every morning to check for gases in the timbers. Others said that cave-ins and explosions were all part of being a miner and that we should set our minds on getting more money. Round and round it went, and nothing much was accomplished. Still, it felt awful important being there with the men. I didn't say anything, just spent my time listening, but I felt respected just the same. I was a Union man, with the full vote and the chance to speak my mind if I wanted. We left in groups of 3s and 4s, moving swiftly and keeping our voices low. "No need to call attention to ourselves," Uncle Jim said when I asked why we were going home this way. "It's best not to wake up the mine boss in his fine house over there." We got home and both of us were surprised to see Aunt Agnes. She was sitting by the stove, rocking back and forth. "Well," she said to us as we walked in. Uncle Jim hung up his hat and coat. "How's Margaret and Belton?" "They're sleeping, thank heaven, resting at last. I see Billy's with you." "That's right," he nodded. Aunt Agnes turned to me. "Well, I expect you're nearly of age now, doing a man's job, aren't you, Billy?" "Yes, ma'am, I reckon. So I guess you're making a man's decisions." "Yes, ma'am." "Well," she looked at me, standing for another moment, then turned back to the fire. And that was all. She never scolded Uncle Jim for letting me join the union or going to meetings. A few days later, as we was walking to the mine, Uncle Jim and I saw a crowd of miners gathered by Luther Spence and his family. They was out in the street, huddling against the cold. Snow was falling on their bare heads, and the older child was barefoot, trying to crawl up into his daddy's arms. Men with guns were inside his home, throwing out chairs and clothes. "It's the Baldwin Felts agents," said Uncle Jim. "They're Mr. Newgate's hired guards. Don't let them see you." He pushed me behind him, but I poked my head around anyway to get a look. Ida Spence had her newborn twins in her arms. Both of them was crying from cold, and the snow was falling in their little pink faces. The Baldwin Felts men didn't pay no mind to the crowd watching. They kept loading the wagon with every single thing the Spences owned, breaking dishes by their feet to scare him and make the little boy cry harder. "Get out of their house!" someone yelled. I looked over to see who it was. It was Clayton. A Baldwin Felts man came out the door and stood on the porch. "This house is the property of the Newgate Coal Company, and Mr. Spence here has broken the terms of his lease by joining the United Mine Workers." "Well, let him keep his things. Don't break up his dishes like that," yelled someone in the crowd. The other guard walked out of the cabin with Ida's kettle in his hand. "We're claiming this here property as payment for the fines Mr. Spence incurred by joining the union." "You guards ain't nothing but thugs," yelled someone else. More folks started calling the guards ruffians, bullies, and thieves. Next thing you know, someone in their crowd threw a rock. Then someone else did. Then someone else, until one of the guards reached in his pocket and pulled out a pistol. I don't know how many times he shot it into the air. Folks jumped and ran for cover, and the crowd dissolved into nothing. Uncle Jim pulled me behind one of the houses nearby, because I was too shocked to move my feet or know which way to turn. Some folks run off. Others, like Uncle Jim and me, hid behind houses to see what would happen next. When the house was empty, the Baldwin Felts men walked the family to the depot where a train had just pulled in. They had their guns out the whole way, and one of them nudged Luther in the ribs with a barrel as he boarded the train to be dumped in a different coal town somewhere in Mingo County. They didn't have nothing but the clothes on their backs, no food or bottles for the babies, not a pot to cook in, nor a penny in a pocket. When the train pulled away, the guards headed back off to the boarding house, laughing and cussing. None of us talked or moved till they was inside and the door closed. Slowly we came out, mumbling about what happened, but keeping our voices low as we walked up the hill to the mine. Clayton caught up to me and Uncle Jim. "There must be a spy, Mr. Barry," he said. "He's taking names at our meetings and passing them on to Mr. Newgate. Those guards are picking on Luther to give us all a scare." "That's right, lad. You and Billy have to keep your ears open. Pay attention to any chaps who keeps talking to you about the meeting or asks you to remind them of what we talked about or who was there. The spy will try to get information from the two of you. He'll figure you're too young to know what he's after." Later on, when the whistle blew and we all come out of the mine, we walked in a whole different world. There was Baldwin Felts guards everywhere. They was on the loading platforms just outside the entrance, scattered along the hillside and the streets of the town. They carried rifles over their arms or walked bloodhounds back and forth. Some of the miners cursed and shook their fists at him. but I was all quivery, near shaking in my boots when I passed. "Don't be afraid, lad," whispered Uncle Jim. "That's what they want, to make us afraid." It was a gray evening without wind or early stars, and the sky was dissolving into snow. It covered up our steps as we walked home. I heard something going pat, pat, pat ever so softly, but didn't know if it was the snow hitting the ground or the blood pulsing in my ears. The next morning, the Baldwin Felts guards filled the town like an army, watching us as we walked to work, looking for any reason at all to shoot or set the dogs on us. They hung outside the company store and walked up and down the village streets. Their dogs leapt when we passed, pulling against their leashes, barking and snarling like they'd just as soon rip us to pieces. When we came out of the mine that evening, Mr. Newgate himself was there, surrounded by guards. There was 8 of them, holding rifles, and the 2 front guards was leading a bear on a leash. A bear! It walked ahead of them about 5 feet or so. They whooped at the bear to make it stand up and take a few steps. It tossed its head and growled, swiping at air with its claws. This made the dogs go crazy. They lowered down on their forelegs, their hackles raised and teeth bared, barking and howling till I wondered if maybe I had died and gone to hell the snake-handling preacher at the orphanage warned us about. But a funny thing happened. Instead of getting scared, I got angry. All of us did. Seeing Mr. Newgate in town, flanked by his guards, with his fat belly near sticking out of his topcoat, only made us more resolved to shut down the mine until he paid us better and gave us safer conditions. The man from the UMW struck out of town and camped out in a holler on the banks of Paint Creek. Some miners stopped coming regular to meetings, for it was altogether a dicier situation. We snuck out of town one by one or in twos, and there was plenty of scares, too. Someone would misjudge where the guard was on his rounds, or we'd hear gunfire at our backs. Plenty of times Uncle Jim would tell me to just freeze and not move a muscle till he could tell if the dogs was coming our way. We'd wait between trees, still as statues, wishing our breath didn't steam the way it did, our hearts pounding, our eyes and ears turned tight and fierce, just like we was animals hunted in the night. The Union men gave us counsel and told us the state of things in the other mining camps up and down Paint Creek and the Tug River. We was planning one big strike that would close all the mines nearby. That way the railroads and the banks would lose big money too, since there'd be no coal to haul and no reason for the coal companies to pay 'em. And if all the mines closed down, Mr. Newgate and the other coal barons would be hard-pressed to bring in enough workers from down south to keep the mines going. And if you're scared of dying, if you think we're pushing too hard and demanding too much, remember that long ago Mr. Newgate decided he'd rather let men die than lose money. To save the cost of a few timbers, he let those men and that boy die. To save money in wages, he makes you work 11 hours instead of 8, letting you fill your lungs with coal dust so that you're an old man at 30, sitting by the fire coughing yourself to death. Sure, he brought his guards into town and they're ready to shoot to kill, but if you think about it, you'll realize he's always been willing to kill, long as he helped you make a profit. I didn't have to think about it. I knew the UMW man was right. Long after midnight, taking different paths and leaving at different times, we headed back to our homes. Clayton shepherded different groups as we got closer to town. He headed out first after the meeting was done, then hung near the edge of town to watch the guards, holding us back or hurrying us on so we'd get back safe.